The morning sun barely crept through the windows of the military base cafeteria when Samuel Harris arrived for his shift. His hands, weathered and marked with the passage of 72 years, trembled slightly as he tied the apron around his waist. The fabric felt stiff and uncomfortable against his frame, but he had learned not to complain. Complaining never helped anyone, especially not an old man who needed this job to keep food on his table and medicine in his cabinet. Samuel had been working at the cafeteria for nearly 6 months now. It wasn't the retirement he had imagined after serving his country for 35 years, but life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them. His pension barely covered the basics, and when his wife Martha fell ill 2 years ago, the medical bills had piled up faster than he could count. Even after her passing, the debt remained, a constant reminder of the woman he had loved and lost. The job itself was simple enough. He served coffee, cleared tables, and occasionally helped in the kitchen when the younger staff needed an extra pair of hands. The generals and high-ranking officers who frequented the cafeteria barely noticed him. To them, he was just another face in the background, someone who existed solely to refill their cups and ensure their meals arrived on time. Samuel didn't mind being invisible. In some ways, it was easier than explaining who he had been, what he had done, and why he now stood behind a counter wearing a stained apron. On this particular morning, the cafeteria buzzed with unusual activity. Word had spread that several top generals from Washington would be visiting the base for an important strategic meeting. The staff had been instructed to ensure everything ran perfectly. The floor had been polished until it gleamed, extra pastries had been ordered, and even the coffee machines had been serviced to guarantee the best brew possible. Samuel moved through his routine with practiced efficiency. He arranged the cups in neat rows, checked the sugar dispensers, and made sure the cream pitchers were filled to the brim. His supervisor, a young man barely 30 years old named Derek, rushed around barking orders at everyone. Derek had never served in the military himself, but he wore his authority like a general commanding troops on a battlefield. "Harris, make sure you stay out of the way when the generals arrive," Derek said, barely glancing in Samuel's direction. "Just keep the coffee flowing and don't engage in conversation unless they speak to you first." "Got it?" Samuel nodded quietly. He had heard similar instructions countless times before. Stay invisible, stay silent, stay in your place. It was the unspoken rule for people like him, the ones who had slipped through the cracks of the system and landed in jobs far below their capabilities. As the morning progressed, the generals began arriving. They walked in with an air of importance, their uniforms crisp and decorated with ribbons and medals that spoke of careers built on strategy, politics, and carefully calculated moves. They gathered around the large conference table in the private dining area, their voices low as they discussed matters of national security and military operations. Samuel moved among them like a ghost, pouring coffee and removing empty plates. His presence went unacknowledged, which suited him just fine. He had learned long ago that recognition often came with questions, and questions led to conversations he preferred to avoid. The past was meant to stay in the past, locked away in memories that surfaced only in the quiet hours of the night when sleep refused to come. One of the generals, a 3-star with graying hair and sharp eyes, gestured impatiently for more coffee. Samuel approached with the pot, his movements steady despite the slight tremor in his hands. As he poured, a drop of coffee splashed onto the saucer. The general looked up with irritation. "Careful there, old-timer," the general said, his tone dismissive. "We can't have spills at a meeting like this." Samuel apologized softly and quickly wiped away the drop with a clean cloth he kept in his apron pocket. The general had already turned back to his colleagues, the incident forgotten as quickly as it had occurred. But Samuel felt the familiar sting of humiliation, the kind that came from being treated as less than human, as if his age and position had erased all the dignity he had once possessed. The meeting continued for hours. Samuel made countless trips back and forth from the kitchen, his feet aching in the worn shoes that needed replacing, but that he couldn't afford to replace just yet. The generals discussed troop movements, budget allocations, and strategic partnerships with foreign allies. Their words drifted over Samuel like white noise, familiar yet distant, reminding him of a world he had once inhabited but to which he no longer belonged. During a brief break in the meeting, Samuel was clearing plates from a side table when he overheard 2 younger officers talking near the doorway. They were discussing a recent conflict in a region Samuel recognized immediately. He had been there decades ago when the situation was different but the stakes equally high. His mind flashed back to those days, to the heat and dust, the sound of gunfire, and the faces of men he had served alongside, some of whom never made it home. "Harris, stop daydreaming and get back to work." Derek's voice cut through his thoughts. Samuel snapped back to the present, nodded and returned to his duties. The afternoon wore on, and the meeting showed no signs of ending soon. Samuel's back ached from standing, and his hands had begun to cramp from carrying heavy trays, but he pushed through the discomfort as he always did. Complaining achieved nothing, and he needed this job too desperately to risk losing it over something as trivial as physical pain. As he refilled the coffee pot in the kitchen, Samuel caught his reflection in the stainless steel surface of the industrial refrigerator. The man staring back at him looked old and tired, his face lined with wrinkles that mapped out years of hardship and loss. It was hard to reconcile that image with the young soldier he had once been, full of purpose and determination, believing that his service would mean something lasting. But life had taught him that meaning was fleeting, that heroism faded into obscurity, and that the country you served didn't always remember your name when you needed it most. Samuel turned away from his reflection and picked up the fresh pot of coffee, ready to return to the dining room and continue serving the men who would never know his story. The next day arrived with the same routine Samuel had grown accustomed to over the past months. He woke before dawn in his small apartment, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear neighbors arguing, and the heating barely worked during winter. His morning ritual consisted of instant coffee, 2 pieces of toast, and the medications that kept his heart functioning properly. The pills were expensive, and sometimes he had to choose between them and other necessities, but he managed. He always managed. The drive to the base took 20 minutes through streets he knew by heart. Samuel drove an old pickup truck that had seen better days, its engine making sounds that worried him but that he couldn't afford to fix properly. As he pulled into the employee parking lot, he noticed more military vehicles than usual. The generals from Washington hadn't left yet, which meant another day of intense service and careful invisibility. Inside the cafeteria, Derek was already barking orders at the morning crew. The young supervisor seemed to thrive on the stress of serving important people, as if their presence elevated his own status somehow. He spotted Samuel entering and immediately waved him over. "Harris, the generals want breakfast at 7 sharp. That gives us 40 minutes to get everything perfect. I need you on coffee duty exclusively today, nothing else. Can you handle that?" Samuel nodded. Coffee duty meant standing ready with fresh pots, anticipating when cups needed refilling, and remaining alert for any gesture or glance that indicated someone wanted service. It was physically easier than running plates, but it required constant attention and the ability to read people quickly. The breakfast service began precisely at 7. The generals arrived looking slightly more relaxed than the previous day, their conversation lighter as they discussed topics beyond military strategy. Samuel moved among them with his coffee pot, filling cups and occasionally catching fragments of their discussions. They talked about golf handicaps, their children's achievements, and upcoming retirements. These were men at the pinnacle of their careers, comfortable in their power and secure in their legacies. As Samuel poured coffee for a 2-star general near the end of the table, the man barely acknowledged him with a slight nod. Samuel had learned to appreciate even these small gestures of recognition. So many simply treated him as an extension of the coffee pot itself, an inanimate object with no thoughts or feelings worth considering. The morning stretched into afternoon, and the generals continued their meetings with brief breaks for meals and coffee. Samuel's feet throbbed, and his lower back sent sharp pains up his spine every time he bent to retrieve a dropped napkin or pick up a fallen spoon. He was too old for this kind of work, but age was a luxury he couldn't afford to acknowledge. Bills didn't care about aching joints or tired muscles. During one of the breaks, Samuel was in the kitchen preparing a fresh pot when he overheard 2 of the younger staff members talking. They were recent hires, probably college students earning extra money, and they spoke with the careless confidence of youth. "Can you believe they have that old guy serving these important people?" one of them said, laughing. "He can barely hold the pot steady. They should have someone younger and more professional doing it." "I heard he's some kind of veteran," the other replied. "But so what? Lots of people served. Doesn't mean you get special treatment when you're working in a cafeteria." Samuel said nothing, He had heard worse over the years, and responding never helped. The young didn't understand, couldn't understand what service truly meant or what it cost. They saw an old man in an apron, not the soldier who had once carried wounded comrades through enemy fire or made decisions that saved lives while risking his own. He returned to the dining room with the fresh coffee, his face carefully neutral. One of the generals was telling a story about a military operation he had commanded, his voice filled with pride as he described the successful outcome. Samuel recognized the operation. He had been there, not as a commander but as someone on the ground, living through what the general now described as a strategic triumph. The reality had been far messier, far more terrifying than the sanitized version being shared over coffee and pastries. As Samuel poured coffee for the storytelling general, his hand trembled slightly. A few drops splashed onto the white tablecloth. The general paused mid-sentence, looking up with irritation. "Steady there," he said sharply. "We don't need a mess." "My apologies, sir," Samuel said quietly, quickly dabbing at the spots with his cloth. The general had already resumed his story, dismissing Samuel's presence as completely as if he had never existed. Samuel stepped back, feeling the familiar weight of invisibility settle over him like a heavy blanket. He wondered sometimes if this was his punishment, if the universe had decided that whatever good he had done in his younger years needed to be balanced by humiliation in his older ones. The afternoon brought a brief respite when the generals left for a tour of the base facilities. Samuel used the time to sit in the kitchen, his feet elevated on a plastic crate while he ate a sandwich he had brought from home. The break room was quiet, most of the other staff having scattered to handle various tasks around the cafeteria. An older kitchen worker named Rosa sat near him, eating her own lunch. She had been kind to Samuel since his first day, one of the few people who treated him like a human being rather than just another pair of hands. "You look tired today, Samuel," she said in her accented English. "Those generals work you too hard." "I'm fine," Samuel replied, though they both knew it was a lie. "Just another day." "You know," Rosa said thoughtfully, "my husband was in the military too. Army. He doesn't talk about it much, but I know it was hard. He says the country forgets the soldiers once they're not needed anymore." Samuel smiled sadly. "Your husband is a wise man." They sat in comfortable silence for a few more minutes before the break ended and duty called them back to work. The generals returned from their tour, ready for afternoon coffee and light snacks. Samuel resumed his position, pot in hand, ready to serve men who would never know his name or his story, men who had built their careers on the backs of soldiers like him, but who couldn't see past the apron to recognize one of their own. The third day of serving the generals began with an unexpected change in weather. Dark clouds gathered over the base, and by mid-morning, rain pounded against the cafeteria windows with a force that seemed almost angry. Samuel found something oddly comforting about the storm. It matched the turbulence he felt inside, the growing exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness and touched something deeper in his soul. The generals seemed irritated by the weather, their plans for another base tour canceled due to the downpour. Instead, they settled in for a longer session in the dining room, spreading out documents and laptops across multiple tables. This meant more work for Samuel, more hours of standing and serving, more opportunities for his trembling hands to betray him. Derek had been particularly demanding that morning, stressed by the extended stay of such important visitors. He snapped at the staff over minor issues, his face red with the kind of anxiety that came from trying to impress people who barely noticed his efforts. Samuel bore the brunt of several sharp comments, each one delivered with a tone that suggested he was more burden than help. "Harris, you missed a spot on table 3, Derek said loudly, pointing at a small coffee ring on the dark wood surface. "I need you to pay attention. These aren't regular customers. They're generals." Samuel cleaned the spot without comment, his jaw tight. He wondered what Derek would say if he knew that Samuel had once briefed generals himself, that he had sat in rooms where decisions of life and death were made, that his opinions had once mattered to men far more powerful than the ones currently occupying this cafeteria. But those days were gone, buried under years of budget cuts, lost paperwork, and a system that had no place for old soldiers who couldn't prove their worth through proper documentation. Samuel had learned that heroism without witnesses was just another story no one believed. and metal stored in a box at home meant nothing to employers looking at a resume with too many gaps and not enough recent experience. The morning dragged on with painful slowness. The generals worked through lunch, requesting sandwiches and more coffee rather than a formal meal. Samuel's back screamed in protest every time he lifted the heavy coffee pot, but he forced his face to remain neutral. Showing pain was a weakness, and weakness led to questions about whether he could still handle the job. Around 2 in the afternoon, a new officer arrived at the base. Samuel noticed him immediately, not because of his rank, though the 4 stars on his shoulders indicated someone of significant importance, but because of the way he carried himself. Unlike the others, who moved with the confidence of men accustomed to deference, this general walked with a different energy, one that seemed more grounded and observant. The new arrival, whose name Samuel later learned was General Marcus Thompson, greeted his colleagues warmly before settling into a chair at the main table. Samuel approached with the coffee pot, his movements automatic after days of repetition. "Coffee, sir?" Samuel asked quietly. General Thompson looked up, and for the first time in 3 days, Samuel felt actually seen. The general's eyes held a sharpness that went beyond casual observation, as if he were looking at Samuel rather than through him. "Yes, thank you," Thompson said, his voice carrying a warmth absent in the others. "That's quite a storm out there, isn't it?" "Yes, sir," Samuel replied, surprised to be engaged in conversation. "Reminds me of monsoon season." The words slipped out before Samuel could stop them. He immediately regretted the comment, worried it might prompt questions he didn't want to answer. But General Thompson simply nodded, a flicker of interest crossing his face before he turned back to his colleagues and their discussion. Samuel retreated to his position near the wall, his heart beating slightly faster than normal. That brief exchange had unsettled him, not because it was unpleasant, but because it reminded him of what he had lost. The camaraderie and mutual respect that once existed between soldiers regardless of rank. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel noticed General Thompson watching him occasionally. It wasn't the dismissive glance of someone checking if their coffee needed refilling, but something more thoughtful, almost curious. Samuel tried to ignore the attention, focusing instead on his duties and avoiding any further interaction that might lead to uncomfortable questions. During a brief break in the discussion, while the other generals stepped out to make phone calls, General Thompson remained at the table reviewing documents. Samuel approached to clear away empty cups, moving as quietly as possible to avoid disturbing the general's concentration. "How long have you been working here?" Thompson asked suddenly without looking up from his papers. Samuel paused, cups balanced precariously on his tray. "About 6 months, sir. And before that?" The question hung in the air like the storm clouds outside. Samuel felt his chest tighten. He could lie, give some vague answer about previous employment, but something in the general's tone suggested he wouldn't accept deflection easily. "I was retired, sir," Samuel said carefully, "but circumstances required me to return to work." Thompson looked up then, his gaze steady and assessing. "Retired from what?" "The military, sir. 35 years of service." The general's expression shifted slightly, a mixture of surprise and something else, perhaps concern or curiosity. Before he could ask another question, the other generals returned, their voices filling the room and breaking the moment. Samuel quickly finished clearing the table and retreated to the kitchen, his hands shaking more than usual. Rosa noticed his distress when he entered. "You okay, Samuel? You look pale." "I'm fine," he said automatically, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just tired." But he wasn't fine. The brief conversation with General Thompson had cracked open a door Samuel had worked hard to keep closed. It reminded him of who he had been, of the respect he had once commanded, of the life he had built and lost. The contrast between past and present felt suddenly unbearable, a weight pressing down on his chest and making it hard to breathe. He took a moment to compose himself, splashing cold water on his face from the sink and forcing deep breaths into his lungs. Outside, the storm continued to rage, the rain beating against the windows like fists demanding entry. Samuel understood how it felt. That desire to break through barriers and make yourself heard, to force the world to acknowledge your existence rather than allowing yourself to fade into the background. But storms eventually passed, and old men in cafeterias learned to swallow their pride and return to work. Samuel dried his face, picked up a fresh coffee pot, and walked back into the dining room, ready to serve men who would likely never understand what it cost him to pour their coffee with steady hands and a silent tongue. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a clean, bright day that seemed to mock Samuel's dark mood. He had barely slept the previous night, his mind replaying the conversation with General Thompson over and over, wondering what the man had seen in him and whether it would lead to complications. Samuel had learned that being noticed was rarely a good thing for people in his position. The cafeteria buzzed with activity as the staff prepared for what Derek promised would be the final day of the general's visit. There was a palpable sense of relief among the workers, everyone eager to return to normal operations without the stress of serving such high-ranking officials. Samuel shared that relief, though for different reasons. Each day of pouring coffee for these men felt like another layer of his dignity being stripped away. General Thompson arrived early, before the other generals, and took a seat at a small table near the window. Samuel approached with the coffee pot, his movements careful and measured. "Good morning, sir," Samuel said, reaching to fill the general's cup. "Good morning," Thompson replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Join me for a moment, would you?" Samuel's heart sank. This was exactly what he had feared. "Sir, I'm not sure that's appropriate. I'm working and my supervisor wouldn't approve." "I'll handle your supervisor," Thompson said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "Please sit." Samuel reluctantly set down the coffee pot and lowered himself into the chair, acutely aware of how inappropriate this must look to anyone watching. Across the cafeteria, he could see Derek's face turning red with either anger or panic, possibly both. "You said you served for 35 years, Thompson began, his fingers wrapped around the coffee cup. "That's a long career." "What branch?" "Army, sir." "What was your rank when you retired?" Samuel hesitated. This was the question he had been dreading, the one that would make the contrast between then and now impossible to ignore. "Colonel, sir." Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained neutral. "Colonel, and now you're serving coffee in a base cafeteria. That's quite a change." "Life happens, sir," Samuel said quietly, eager to end this conversation and return to the safety of anonymity. "Sometimes circumstances change." "I noticed something yesterday," Thompson said, leaning forward slightly. "When you mentioned monsoon season, there was a familiarity in your voice. Where did you serve?" The memories came flooding back unbidden. The heat, the humidity, the sound of helicopters overhead, the faces of young soldiers looking to him for guidance. The impossible decisions made with incomplete information, the weight of responsibility for lives that could be lost with a single wrong call. "Multiple deployments, sir, including Southeast Asia during the conflicts in the 80s and 90s. Then later in the Middle East." Thompson nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Samuel's face. "Heavy combat zones. I'm guessing you saw significant action." "Yes, sir." "And yet here you are, serving coffee." "No offense intended, but something doesn't add up. The military takes care of its veterans, especially senior officers with extensive combat experience." "What happened?" Samuel felt the familiar knot forming in his stomach. How could he explain the cascade of failures that had led him here? The paperwork lost in a fire at a storage facility, the pension complications that took years to sort out, during which he had to survive somehow, the medical bills from his wife's illness that consumed his savings, the gaps in his employment history that made other jobs impossible to secure, the age discrimination that was never stated but always present. "It's complicated, sir," Samuel said finally. "The system doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. Things fell through the cracks and I fell with them." Before Thompson could respond, Derek appeared at the table, his face flushed and his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Excuse me, General Thompson, sir. I apologize for Harris disturbing you. He should be working, not sitting down." "I'll remove him immediately." Thompson's expression hardened. "You'll do no such thing. I asked him to join me." "Is there a problem with that?" "No, sir, of course not, sir," Derek stammered, backpedaling quickly. "I just thought he should be performing his duties." "His duties can wait 5 minutes." "Leave us." Derek retreated, shooting Samuel a look that promised consequences later. Samuel sighed inwardly. This conversation, well-intentioned as it might be, was going to cost him. Supervisors didn't appreciate employees who made them look bad in front of important people. "I apologize for that," Thompson said once Derek was out of earshot. "Continue. You were saying things fell through the cracks." "With respect, sir, I appreciate your concern, but there's nothing to be done about it. This is my situation now and I've accepted it. I don't need pity or charity. Who said anything about pity? Thompson's voice carried a slight edge. I'm trying to understand how a decorated colonel ends up serving coffee. The military doesn't just forget about its senior officers, especially ones with combat experience. There has to be more to this story. Samuel felt his defenses rising. What do you want me to say, sir? That the system failed me? That after giving 35 years of my life I was left with inadequate support when I needed it most? That bureaucracy and red tape matter more than service and sacrifice? Would that make you feel better about your coffee? The words came out sharper than he intended, tinged with bitterness that had been building for months. He immediately regretted the outburst, expecting Thompson to react with anger at the insubordination. But the general simply studied him with those sharp, assessing eyes. Actually, Thompson said quietly, it would make me angry, because if what you're saying is true, then we've failed you, and that's unacceptable. The sincerity in his voice caught Samuel off guard. He had expected dismissal, perhaps some vague promise to look into things that would never materialize. Instead, Thompson seemed genuinely troubled by what he was hearing. It's not just me, sir, Samuel said, his anger fading into resignation. There are others like me, veterans who served faithfully and then found themselves struggling to survive in civilian life. The ones who don't have the right connections or the paperwork in perfect order. We're the forgotten ones, the cracks in the system that everyone talks about fixing but never actually does. Thompson was silent for a long moment, his coffee growing cold in the cup. Around them, the cafeteria continued its usual morning routine. Other staff members carefully avoiding looking at the unusual sight of a four-star general, in deep conversation with a cafeteria worker. I want to help, Thompson finally said. But I need to understand the full situation. Would you be willing to meet with me privately? Perhaps after your shift ends today? Bring whatever documentation you have, any records of your service and the issues you've faced. Samuel wanted to refuse. Experience had taught him that promises from powerful people rarely translated into actual help. But something in Thompson's demeanor, a sincerity that seemed genuine, made him reconsider. I don't want to waste your time, sir, Samuel said carefully. Let me worry about my time. Will you meet with me? After a moment's hesitation, Samuel nodded. Yes, sir. My shift ends at 6. Good, I'll arrange for a private office. And Samuel, Thompson added, using his first name for the first time, wear your uniform if you still have it. The one with all your medals and decorations. I want to see the full picture of who you really are. The request sent a chill down Samuel's spine. His uniform hung in the back of his closet, untouched for years. The medals stored in a box he rarely opened because looking at them hurt too much. But he agreed, sensing that this meeting might lead somewhere, though he couldn't yet imagine where. The rest of Samuel's shift passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Derek kept shooting him suspicious glances, clearly worried about what had been discussed with General Thompson. The other generals had arrived, and were going through their final meetings, oblivious to the tension radiating from their colleague who had become uncharacteristically quiet and contemplative. Samuel performed his duties mechanically, his mind already racing ahead to the evening meeting. What could come of it? Would Thompson actually follow through? Or would this turn out to be another empty gesture? A powerful man momentarily moved by a sad story, but ultimately too busy to effect real change. Samuel had learned not to hope too much because hope made the disappointment that followed even more painful. At 4 o'clock, Thompson approached him during a break in the meetings. The general spoke quietly so the others wouldn't overhear. Conference room C, 615. I've cleared it for our use. The base commander is aware of the meeting and has given his approval. Samuel nodded, noticing how the other generals glanced over with curiosity. No doubt they wondered why Thompson was paying so much attention to a cafeteria worker. Let them wonder. Samuel had stopped caring what people thought of him months ago. When his shift finally ended at 6, Samuel hurried to his truck and drove the short distance to his apartment. His hands trembled as he unlocked the door, not from age or exhaustion but from nerves. The uniform hung exactly where he had left it, protected by a garment bag that had accumulated a light layer of dust. He lifted it out carefully, surprised by how heavy it felt, though the weight was more emotional than physical. The dress uniform still fit, though it was slightly loose around the waist. Samuel had lost weight over the past year, stress and poor eating habits taking their toll. He buttoned the jacket slowly, each button feeling like a connection to a past self he barely recognized anymore. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar from the closet, mixed with something else, the ghost of old memories and younger days. The medals came next. They were stored in a wooden box his wife had given him on their 20th anniversary, lined with velvet and divided into compartments. Samuel's fingers traced over each one, memories flooding back with every touch. The Bronze Star for valor during a rescue operation. The Purple Heart from the injury that had nearly ended his career, but that he had pushed through with stubborn determination. The various service medals representing years of dedication and countless sacrifices. And then, at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a separate cloth, the one medal he rarely looked at because it hurt too much to remember, the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, awarded for an action that had saved 23 lives but had cost him pieces of his soul he could never recover. Samuel had earned it during a mission that went catastrophically wrong. His unit had been ambushed in a valley with no cover and limited ammunition. As the commanding officer, he could have ordered a retreat, saved himself and whatever men could make it out. Instead, he had positioned himself as the primary target, drawing enemy fire while coordinating an evacuation that got his soldiers to safety. He had held that position for nearly 2 hours, wounded twice until reinforcements arrived. The medal had been presented by the president himself in a ceremony that felt surreal. Newspapers had covered the story. For a brief time, Samuel Harris had been a hero, his name known and respected. But years passed and heroes were forgotten. New conflicts created new heroes, and old ones faded into the background of history. Their sacrifices remembered in abstract, but their names and faces lost to time. Samuel pinned the Medal of Honor to his uniform with unsteady hands. It felt wrong somehow wearing it now after everything. What would those 23 soldiers think if they could see him serving coffee in a base cafeteria? Would they understand? Or would they feel the same shame he felt every day when he tied on that apron? He arrived at the base at 6:10, parking his truck in the visitor lot and walking toward the administrative building. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parade ground. A few soldiers jogged past on an evening run, their youth and energy a stark contrast to Samuel's slow, measured steps. Conference room C was on the second floor. Samuel found it easily, the door slightly ajar. He knocked softly and General Thompson's voice called for him to enter. The general stood when Samuel walked in, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the full uniform with its impressive array of medals and ribbons, but his gaze fixed on the Medal of Honor, his expression shifting from surprise to something approaching shock. "Colonel Harris," Thompson said, his voice carrying a new weight of respect. "Please sit down." Samuel took the offered chair, uncomfortable with the formality but unwilling to refuse. Thompson sat across from him, several folders spread on the table that Samuel recognized as military records. "I spent the afternoon making some calls and pulling files," Thompson began. "Your service record is remarkable. Multiple combat deployments, commendations for leadership under fire, innovations in tactical strategy that are still taught at West Point. And this," he gestured toward the Medal of Honor, "this represents an action of extraordinary heroism. Why didn't you tell me this morning?" "Would it have changed anything, sir?" Samuel asked quietly. "A medal doesn't pay rent or buy medications. It doesn't erase debt or make employers overlook a gap in employment history. It's a symbol of something I did long ago, but it doesn't help me survive today." Thompson leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. "I've been reviewing your file and I've found several irregularities in how your retirement was processed. There were administrative errors that significantly reduced your pension. Your medical records from your final years of service somehow got separated from your main file, which meant conditions related to your service weren't properly documented for VA benefits. And there's a notation here about a fire at a records facility that destroyed backup documentation you would need to appeal these issues. I know all this, sir," Samuel said, unable to keep the weariness from his voice. "I've spent years trying to fix it. Every office sends me to another office. Every form requires documentation I don't have. Every appeal gets denied because I can't prove what was lost in the fire. The system is designed to help veterans, but it's also designed in a way that makes it almost impossible to navigate if something goes wrong. And things went wrong for me at every turn." "What about your Medal of Honor?" Thompson asked. Recipients receive a special pension, additional benefits. Why aren't you receiving those? Samuel's laugh was bitter. Because the original citation and supporting documentation were in the records that burned. I have the medal, I have photographs from the ceremony, but apparently that's not enough. They need the official paperwork, which doesn't exist anymore. Without it, I can't prove I'm entitled to those benefits. It's absurd, but that's bureaucracy for you. Thompson's jaw tightened. That's more than bureaucracy. That's a fundamental failure of the system we built to honor and support our veterans, and it's unacceptable. He pulled out a notepad and began writing quickly, his pen moving with decisive strokes. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to personally intervene in your case. I have contacts at the Pentagon, at the VA, and in congressional offices. We're going to reconstruct your documentation using secondary sources, eyewitness testimonies, and anything else we can find. The Medal of Honor recipients are tracked separately in multiple databases. We'll find proof. Samuel wanted to believe him, but years of disappointment had taught him caution. Sir, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I've heard promises before. The system is bigger than any one person, even a 4-star general. You're right, Thompson said, meeting his eyes directly. The system is broken in ways that one person can't fix entirely. But I can fix your individual situation, and I can make enough noise about it that others pay attention. Your story isn't unique, Colonel Harris. There are other veterans falling through similar cracks. But your situation, with the Medal of Honor involved, makes it particularly egregious and impossible to ignore once it becomes known. He paused, his expression softening slightly. You saved 23 soldiers that day in the valley. I know because I looked up the after-action reports. Do you know what happened to them? Samuel shook his head. After the ceremony, he had lost track of most of them, his own struggles consuming all his attention and energy. 12 of them are still in the service, Thompson said. Several have reached senior ranks themselves. The others went on to successful civilian careers. They've raised families, contributed to their communities, lived full lives because you gave them the chance to do so. That matters, Colonel. That will always matter, regardless of where you are now or what you're doing. Your heroism doesn't have an expiration date. The rest of Samuel's shift passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Derek kept shooting him suspicious glances, clearly worried about what had been discussed with General Thompson. The other generals had arrived, and were going through their final meetings, oblivious to the tension radiating from their colleague who had become uncharacteristically quiet and contemplative. Samuel performed his duties mechanically, his mind already racing ahead to the evening meeting. What could come of it? Would Tom... Samuel felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he had built to protect himself from feeling too much. Thompson's words, spoken with such conviction, penetrated defenses he thought were impenetrable. For the first time in years, tears threatened to surface, but he forced them back through sheer will. He had survived too much to break down now, even in the face of unexpected kindness. I stopped thinking about that day, Samuel admitted, his voice rough with emotion. It hurt too much to remember what I had been, what I had done when I was struggling just to keep food on the table and a roof over my head. It felt like the universe was mocking me, like all that sacrifice meant nothing in the end. It meant everything, Thompson said firmly, and I'm going to make sure the country honors that sacrifice the way it should have from the beginning. But I need something from you in return. Samuel looked up, wary again. Nothing came free, not really. What do you need, sir? I need you to stop hiding. I need you to let me tell your story to the people who can make a difference. And I need you to believe that you deserve better than serving coffee in a cafeteria, not because there's anything wrong with that work, but because you've already given more than most people give in 10 lifetimes. The request terrified Samuel in ways combat never had. Hiding had become his survival mechanism, his way of protecting himself from more disappointment and pain. The thought of putting himself out there, of letting his story be told and judged, made his heart race with anxiety. I don't want to be a symbol or a sob story, Samuel said. I don't want people's pity. This isn't about pity, Thompson replied. It's about justice, and it's about making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to other veterans. Your situation exposes serious flaws in how we process retirements, maintain records, and support our people after they've served. Fixing your case will create precedents that help others. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through something before turning the screen toward Samuel. I took the liberty of contacting a few people this afternoon. One of them is Senator Mitchell, who chairs the Armed Services Committee. She's very interested in your case. Another is the head of the Veterans Administration, and I reached out to 3 of the soldiers you saved that day, the ones still in active service. They want to help. They remember what you did, and they're outraged that you've been left in this situation. Samuel stared at the phone, seeing names and contact information that represented power and influence far beyond anything he could have accessed on his own. The machinery was already in motion, set in action by a general who apparently had no intention of letting this go. "This is really happening," Samuel said, more to himself than to Thompson. "After all this time, something is actually happening." "It is," Thompson confirmed. "But I need to know you're ready for what comes next. There will be attention, maybe media coverage. Your story is compelling, and once it gets out, people will want to talk to you, interview you, hear directly from you. Can you handle that?" The question hung between them. Samuel thought about the past months, the daily humiliation of being invisible, the ache of being forgotten. Maybe being seen again, truly seen, would be worth the discomfort of attention. "I can handle it," Samuel said, surprised by the strength in his own voice. "I've handled worse." Thompson smiled, the first genuine smile Samuel had seen from him. "I believe you have. Now let's get practical. First thing tomorrow, I'm putting you on temporary paid leave from the cafeteria. You won't need that job much longer, and I don't want Derek giving you any trouble while we sort this out." "I need that income, sir," Samuel protested. "I can't just stop working. The leave is paid, and I'm personally ensuring you receive compensation equal to what you would have earned. Consider it an advance on the back pension you're owed. Beyond that, I'm arranging for emergency VA benefits to be activated immediately while we work through the formal appeals process. You'll have enough to cover your expenses and then some." The relief that washed over Samuel was almost physical. For months he had lived with constant anxiety about money, about making rent, about affording his medications. The idea that this burden might actually lift felt almost too good to be true. "I don't know how to thank you, sir," Samuel said, his voice breaking slightly. "Don't thank me yet," Thompson said. "We have a long road ahead. Bureaucracy moves slowly, even with high-level intervention. But I promise you this, I won't stop pushing until everything is resolved. You have my personal commitment on that." He stood, extending his hand formally. Samuel rose and shook it, feeling the firm grip of a fellow soldier, someone who understood duty and honor in ways civilians never quite grasped. "One more thing," Thompson said as Samuel prepared to leave. "Tomorrow morning I'm calling a meeting with all the generals who have been here this week. I want you there in your dress uniform. It's time they knew who's been serving their coffee." Samuel's stomach clenched. "Is that necessary, sir? I'd rather not make a scene. It's absolutely necessary. Those men need to understand that veterans don't stop being veterans just because they're not in active service anymore. They need to see what their oversight and bureaucratic indifference has created. And frankly, they need to be reminded that the people serving them, regardless of their current positions, deserve basic respect and dignity." There was steel in Thompson's voice, a determination that Samuel recognized from his own years of command. When a leader decided something needed to be done, obstacles became challenges to overcome rather than reasons to quit. "What time, sir?" Samuel asked. 0800, Conference Room A. "Wear every medal you've earned. I want them to see the full measure of what this country owes you." Samuel left the base that night with his mind spinning. He drove home slowly, processing everything that had happened. The uniform still felt strange on his body, like wearing someone else's skin. But it also felt right in ways he had forgotten. This was who he had been, who he perhaps still was underneath the layers of defeat and resignation. At home, he carefully hung the uniform in a more accessible part of his closet. Tomorrow he would wear it again, would stand before men who had seen him only as a servant and reveal himself as something entirely different. The thought terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Before bed, Samuel opened the wooden box containing his medals one more time. He touched the Medal of Honor gently, remembering not just the day he earned it but all the days that followed, the ones filled with paperwork and bureaucracy and slowly diminishing hope. Maybe Thompson could actually fix things, or maybe this would turn out to be another disappointment. But for the first time in a very long time, Samuel allowed himself to hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of someone drowning and grasping at straws, but a stronger hope built on the foundation of one man's determination to make things right. Thompson had the power, The connections and apparently the will to see this through. That had to count for something. Samuel slept better that night than he had in months. His dreams filled not with anxiety and stress but with memories of better times, of purpose and meaning, of a life lived in service to something greater than himself. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight he could rest knowing that someone finally saw him, truly saw him, and considered him worthy of help. Samuel arrived at the base at 7:30, giving himself extra time to compose his thoughts and steady his nerves. The dress uniform felt more comfortable this morning, as if his body was remembering how to wear it properly. He checked his reflection in the truck's side mirror and saw a different man than the one who had looked back at him just days ago. The uniform, the medals, the posture he had unconsciously adopted all transformed him from invisible cafeteria worker to decorated veteran. The walk to conference room A felt longer than it should have. Samuel's heart pounded with each step, anxiety mixing with something else he couldn't quite name. Not quite courage, but perhaps the beginning of reclaimed dignity. He had faced enemy fire without flinching, had made life and death decisions under impossible pressure. Yet this meeting with a group of generals terrified him in a completely different way. General Thompson was already in the conference room when Samuel arrived, reviewing notes at the head of the long table. He looked up and smiled when Samuel entered. "Colonel Harris, good morning. Thank you for coming." The use of his rank, spoken with respect rather than as a historical footnote, steadied Samuel's nerves somewhat. "Morning, sir," Samuel replied, standing at attention out of habit. "At ease, Colonel. The others will be here shortly. I want to brief you on what's going to happen. I've prepared a presentation about your case, including your service record, the Medal of Honor action, and the series of administrative failures that led to your current situation. I'll be presenting this information to my colleagues not just to address your specific case, but to illustrate a systemic problem that needs immediate attention." Samuel nodded, his throat too tight for words. The magnitude of what Thompson was doing, the political capital he was spending on behalf of someone he had known for less than a week, was almost overwhelming. The generals began arriving at 7:55, filing in with the punctuality that military culture demanded. They greeted Thompson warmly, exchanging pleasantries and settling into their seats. Several glanced at Samuel with curiosity, clearly wondering why a cafeteria worker in full dress uniform was present at their meeting. One or two showed flickers of recognition, perhaps remembering him from the past few days. The three-star general who had complained about the coffee spill did a visible double-take when he noticed the Medal of Honor on Samuel's chest. His expression shifted from confusion to something approaching discomfort, as if he was beginning to realize this meeting was not going to be the standard briefing he had anticipated. At precisely 8 o'clock, Thompson called the meeting to order. "Gentlemen, thank you for gathering this morning. I know you're all eager to get back to your respective commands, but I need your attention for something critically important. What I'm about to share with you should concern everyone in this room, not just as military leaders, but as human beings who have sworn to support and defend not just the Constitution, but the people who serve under it." He pulled up a slide on the screen showing Samuel's official service photograph from his years as a colonel. The image showed a younger man, confident and strong, with clear eyes and a firm jaw. The contrast with the older man standing in the room was stark but undeniable. They were the same person. This is Colonel Samuel Harris, United States Army, retired. Many of you have met him over the past few days. He's been serving your coffee, clearing your plates, and essentially being invisible to most of you. What you didn't know is that Colonel Harris is a Medal of Honor recipient who saved 23 lives during an action in which he personally held off an enemy force for nearly 2 hours while wounded multiple times. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Samuel, and he felt the weight of their scrutiny. Thompson continued, pulling up slide after slide detailing Samuel's service record, his deployments, his commendations, the Medal of Honor citation, and then the tragic series of administrative failures that had brought him to work in a cafeteria. The records fire destroyed critical documentation. Pension calculations were processed incorrectly and couldn't be appealed without the missing paperwork. Medical conditions related to service were not properly documented for VA benefits, and because the Medal of Honor paperwork was lost, Colonel Harris couldn't access the special benefits afforded to recipients of our nation's highest military decoration. He has spent the last several years fighting a system that should have been fighting for him. Thompson's voice carried an edge of controlled anger. This is not just about one man. Though Colonel Harris's case is particularly egregious, this represents a fundamental failure in how we process retirements, maintain records, and support our veterans after they've completed their service. Every person in this room has the power and the responsibility to ensure this never happens again. The three-star general who had complained about the spilled coffee stood up, his face flushed. "General Thompson, I had no idea." "Colonel Harris, I apologize for my conduct. I spoke to you with disrespect and I'm ashamed of that." Another general, a two-star, added his voice. "This is unacceptable. How did this slip through so many levels of oversight? Because we stopped seeing veterans as individuals and started seeing them as case numbers," Thompson replied bluntly. "Because bureaucracy became more important than people. Because the system we built to help them became a maze so complex that anyone with missing documentation gets trapped in it indefinitely. And because men like Colonel Harris, who sacrificed everything for their country, are too proud or too tired or too broken by the system to keep fighting for what they're owed." He turned to Samuel. "Colonel Harris, would you like to say anything?" Samuel hadn't prepared remarks. He had assumed he would just stand there while Thompson did the talking. But now, with all eyes on him, he found words emerging from a place deep inside, words he hadn't known he needed to speak. "I don't tell you this to shame you," Samuel began, his voice quiet but steady. "Most of you are good men doing difficult jobs. But I want you to understand something. When I put on this uniform 50 years ago, I made a promise to serve with honor and integrity. I kept that promise through multiple wars, through injuries, through personal sacrifices that cost me relationships and pieces of my soul. I never asked for special treatment or for recognition beyond what my actions merited." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But when my service ended, I expected the country I had served to keep its promises too. Not as charity, not as a favor, but as basic honoring of the contract we all sign when we put on this uniform. That didn't happen. Instead, I found myself fighting a new kind of battle, one against paperwork and bureaucracy and systems that treated me like a problem to be processed, rather than a person who had given everything." His voice grew stronger. "I took the job in the cafeteria because I needed to survive. There's no shame in honest work, regardless of what it is. But there should be shame in a system that forces a Medal of Honor recipient to serve coffee just to afford his medications. There should be shame in a bureaucracy so complex and inflexible that it can lose track of people who dedicated their lives to service. And there should be shame in how easy it is for all of us, military and civilian alike, to stop seeing the people who serve us in whatever capacity and to treat them as invisible." The room remained silent. Several generals had the grace to look uncomfortable. Samuel felt a strange sense of liberation speaking these truths, giving voice to frustrations and pain he had suppressed for so long. Thompson spoke again. "I've already initiated the process to correct Colonel Harris's situation. The Pentagon is reviewing his case personally, the VA has expedited emergency benefits, and Senator Mitchell's office is preparing legislation to prevent these kinds of administrative failures from trapping other veterans. But I want everyone here to take a more personal lesson from this. Look at the people around you. Really look at them. The private who salutes you might be dealing with problems you can't imagine. The civilian contractor might be a veteran struggling to transition. The person serving your coffee might have saved lives in ways you'll never fully understand. Don't let rank or position or current circumstances blind you to the fundamental dignity every person deserves." He gestured to Samuel. "Colonel Harris will be leaving his position at the cafeteria effective immediately. He'll be working with me and my staff over the coming months as we document his case and use it as a foundation for systemic reform. I expect full cooperation from every command represented in this room. If any of you encounter similar situations, I want to know about them immediately. We're going to fix this. Not just for Colonel Harris, but for every veteran who has fallen through the cracks." The meeting concluded with several generals approaching Samuel personally to apologize and offer their support. The three-star general gripped his hand firmly, genuine remorse in his eyes. "I wish I had known. I wish I had asked. Thank you for your service, Colonel, and I'm sorry we failed you." Samuel accepted the apologies with grace, understanding that these men were products of the same system that had failed him. Well-intentioned but often blind to the consequences of bureaucratic complexity. Real change would take time and effort, but Thompson's intervention had at least a conversation. As the room cleared, Thompson pulled Samuel aside. "How are you holding up?"